Hello everyone, I'm Julia and today we'll be talking about cutting fabric. We also have many different cutting tools. The most common are fabric scissors and a rotary cutter. So fabric scissors are very sharp and a rotary cutter is a rounded blade that you'd run along your fabric. When using a rotary cutter, you have to use a cutting mat in order not to scratch your table. I prefer using fabric scissors for lightweight cottons or heavy denims, things that don't slip as much, and rotary cutters for things that may slip around, move when picked up, or things like leathers that you want to get a nice precise cut. We also have our fabric weights. There are many different types of fabric weights. These are homemade, they're washers wrapped in ribbon. And we also have, of course, our pins. Usually I find fabric weights are easier to use with a rotary cutter and pins are easier to use with scissors. But whatever way works for you, sometimes I will use a fabric weight with scissors. I have half a yard of fabric here that I've lined up my Selvage Edge together and folded it on the other side and ironed it nice and flat. When you have fabric yardage, your Selvage Edge is this finished edge here. It's finished on both sides. The selvage tells you the grain of your fabric. So fabric has a grain going vertically, which always follows your selvage, horizontally, which is perpendicular to your selvage, and on the bias, which is diagonal, and cuts that way give your fabric stretch. For most fabric patterns, you'll be placing them along your selvage edge, following your grain line on your pattern. So for this, I'm going to use my scissors, and before I start pinning, I have to place my fabric. So this pattern is a mask pattern. I would cut two of it, or one front of a mask. You may have to cut multiples of your patterns. That is dependent on your design, but I will be following my straight lines along the grain. And so an easy way to line up your selvage is to pin two selvages together, make sure everything's lying flat, and press your fold like I have. And since I'm putting it on top of a folded piece of fabric, I'm getting two layers. And these two layers, so the right sides are on the opposite. So if I cut through here, I'm going to get this direction on one side, and I'm going to get it facing this direction on the other. So the reason we cut on fold is so that I'll get two opposite facing prints. So if I was cutting a blouse and I had my two backs lying here, I would get the two back sides on opposite sides so that they're reflected and I get a full bodice back. Same with if you cut your front on fold, I would then open my fold up and have two reflected bodice fronts. Now I know I'm going to be cutting multiple of these patterns, so I'm going to need this whole stretch of fabric, but if I was just cutting one piece, I might not want to cut here in the corner and cut out a corner on both sides. I might want to lay out my fabric and cut it along this way if I wanted to keep a full stretch of fabric available. Or if I had a pattern that was cut on fold, so my straight edge here, only straight edges can be cut on the fold because a curve obviously cannot fold with the fabric. So if I had my straight edge that needed to be cut on fold, this case it does not, but if I did, I would have to line it up with this fold. Now if I cut it out of this fold, and this was the only pattern piece that I was cutting, I would be cutting a big section out of the center of my fabric. So a nicer solution, rather than doing that, is to again open up your fabric and take a section of it and fold your selvage over. Now I don't have another selvage to line this up with, so that makes it a little bit harder, but if I pull it a little bit more, Make sure it's the size of my pattern if I'm cutting something small. Okay, so my selvage ends right about here, so I have just enough room for this piece. Now I can check actually along here, and for most cottons, you can see the weave of the fabric. You can see each grain. So if I follow a singular thread, I can make sure that my fold is straight. Could iron this down. This is cotton, so I can actually just press it down with my finger. Making sure that's straight, because your cut line up here might not always be straight. You can see mine is a little bit off. And if you have a cutting mat, you can use your cutting mat as a guideline to help you. You can also use a gridded ruler, line it up along your selvage. Make sure that you're following a straight section. So my fold is hitting right between two of these lines, and it's running parallel to the line, so I know that that is straight. You can always line up your edge or line up one of these straight lines on your gridded ruler. Now if I didn't want to be cutting a big section out of the middle of my fabric, I could use this as my fold and do that along if I needed more, or cut down this way. I tend to cut across so that I try and keep a selvage edge as much as possible. So you can cut with the right side of your fabric facing you, or with the wrong sides facing you. If you needed to mark anything while you were cutting, it would be easier to cut on the wrong side. I'm cutting on the right side so that you can see the print of this fabric, and make sure it's, if you had a print that was a specific placement, say I wanted a certain line of lemons along, I would have to place my fabric accordingly, and I'd want to look at the print. That, of course, you will use more fabric than if you just place along what fits best. If I have a print like this, there's not really a direction to this print. It kind of, if I put my pattern this way, then flipped it this way, now my pattern is upside down. The top of the pattern is on the bottom as opposed to before it was over here. With this print, I can change it up as much as I need as long as I'm following the grain line of my pattern. So as long as I'm keeping this aligned and straight, I can change this as much as I need. For this specific fabric, for like a regular woven cotton, my selvage grain, which is my like vertical grain, and my horizontal grain are the same generally. You can do a little stretch test, make sure that they are the same. And the reason that we'd make sure that it's on selvage is so that it's straight, the grain doesn't stretch. If you're using a woven, you may intentionally cut pieces on the bias, and then you would align them this way. So your grain's going diagonally. If I was cutting a piece on the bias, I may have my grain already marked going diagonally, and I would follow that. Going this way, bias takes up a lot more fabric than cutting along the grain does. Since my fabric is the same type of grain, going vertically and horizontally, I could also turn this way to conserve space. If it was a fabric like a satin that may change direction, may look different going one way than the other, I'd want to double check my fabric before turning any patterns or even flipping them upside down. Some fabrics you do need to keep it in a specific direction. If I had a print like this, where the leaves are clearly going in a specific direction, going up and down my fabric, if I chose to cut it this way, I would want to keep it consistent and always cut my patterns going along the vertical grain so that my print matches up. I could choose to have my print going horizontally if I want the leaves to go that way, and then I would choose to cut my fabric this way. And I could turn it this way or upside down to conserve fabric, but I'd have to keep it with the leaves going in the same direction unless I intentionally chose to have the print flip. You may also have to pick a specific direction when using textured fabrics that have what's called a nap, like a velvet or a corduroy. They will change directions depending on which way you. So now for actually placing my patterns down, I'm going to be repeating this one pattern. You may have multiple different patterns that you're aligning. If you have multiple patterns, I would try and lay them out before you start cutting. For repeating one pattern like this one, I pick a way to start it. I'm going to start in this top corner. I think I would use less fabric if I flipped it upside down, because this curve is softer than this curve, so I can line it against the top of my fabric. So even when I'm repeating just one pattern, I tend to place it out as I'm going. I could also flip it this way and then be able to line up my pattern pieces straight. And that, I tend to feel that that wastes a lot more fabric. The best thing to do is to keep your amount of fabric consumption as small as possible so that you can keep using. So I'm going to have it with my straight side here, so then I can butt up the curves of my fabric and I won't have such a deep open space like before. I don't need to actually see any of my pattern while I'm cutting it, so it's okay for me to flip it upside down. So now I would pin my fabric in, and so in something that's along the selvage, I'll pin the grain line first. Again, if you had your grain line drawn on the front and you didn't have a straight line cut here, you'd probably want to be looking at your grain line and pinning along it. I usually try to pin pointing towards the outside, especially with a curve. And so notice how when I just pinned, it actually lifted my fabric. So I want to straighten this back out, make sure everything's flat, and I make sure all the corners are down. You want to keep your pattern as flat as possible. I may even want to put some more pins in here. I try and do as few pins, keeping it as secure as possible. So the more pins you have close together, the more likely your pattern and fabric are going to start rippling. If it's a little bumpy, you may want to take out some of your pins and readjust them. Now I can cut this piece. I'm making sure that I'm not cutting into my pattern so that it's nice and clean, and because I don't want to ruin my fabric scissors. You want to have separate fabric and paper scissors so that your fabric scissors stay sharp. Cutting other things other than fabric will dull your scissors. I'm going to cut off my selvage here. You don't want to use your selvage because it's a different type of weave. It's a little bit usually thicker. It's often not printed. So now I can take out my pins and take off my pattern because I'm going to be using this pattern again. If you needed to mark anything on your pattern, you may do that before you unpin it. Now that I've cut out one pattern, lay out some more. So I could come this way again, but like I said before, since this print doesn't really have a true direction to it, I can actually change my direction. So I could come this way, even take one of my freshly cut pieces to lay out. As I said before, if your fabric does have a change in grain in the vertical direction versus the horizontal direction, you may not be able to flip your patterns like this. And even when I do flip them this way, I still need to make sure that my grain line is straight. It's just following along in the opposite direction now. And I can check with my gridded ruler, line it up along my selvage, and it's perpendicular. So I want to make sure that this curve is as close to this one as I can, giving me enough seam allowance. That'll help my patterns fit together nicely. I wouldn't cut out with those freshly cut pieces, using them as a pattern, but they are helpful to place. So now I know once I've cut this one, I can move it. But I only need one more of this pattern. So I'm not actually going to cut these. I have a pleated mask pattern that I'm going to use for some other ones in this print. So nicely lay this out. Now if I did want this on the fold, I would lay it this way. And try and fit in one more of these patterns. I can't fit it that way. Can I fit it this way? It's a little awkward. I might try and shift this around a little bit, maybe fold it over this way. So I could fold my fabric that way to get a fold. Come along there. Luckily though, I'm splitting this into multiple pieces. So having the front as a print and the back as a solid, another way to conserve fabric when using a print. If you don't need to see the underside, it doesn't need to be matching. So I have seam allowance on all edges of this pattern, so I can turn it in the direction that I want because the print of this fabric allows me to do so. So I can lay that out. And even though I don't need it on the fold, I can still use this fold to guide my pattern placement. So I'm actually going to put it relatively close to the edge, giving me just a little bit more room in here. And so this time, I'm going to use my pattern weights. So I can still slide these a little bit. If I had heavier pattern weights, I probably wouldn't be able to. I'm just sliding it a little bit away from the edge of this cut so that I can make sure that my cut comes out nice and clean. I'm going to use my rotary cutter for this one. Like I said before, I usually don't use rotary cutters for thin quilting cottons like this. Sometimes you need to just cut it a little bit, get a cleaner edge. And because these fabric weights are so light and small, I can kind of move them around. If I was using bigger fabric weights, I might have to pin this one because the fabric weight would get in the way. When cutting straight lines, you can also line up your ruler along your rotary cutter. This plastic ruler most likely will get cut and nicked by the rotary cutter. I'll tend to use a metal ruler when I'm lining up my rotary cutter. But for these curved lines, I much prefer to just go around the pattern and kind of rock it back and forth to pull tight to this curve. And so another reason you would use a rotary cutter and fabric weights instead of pins is because not all fabrics can be pinned. Something like a leather or a faux leather, if the pins will leave holes in the fabric, so you can't pin it. So my rotary cutter has become a little bit dull from using it with leather so much that it's not really sharp enough to cut through these fibers, which is another reason you have to keep your blades sharp. I actually go around this curve with my scissors. As you can see, I can still use the fabric weights pretty easily. Fabric weights can save a lot of time with pinning and allow it to remain a lot flatter while you're cutting. So lastly, I have this piece. Another option you can do is just put some pattern weights in the middle to keep it flat and in place. I like that I can move this as I go versus if I started pinning. It would be a lot harder to kind of shift it and make sure it stays aligned if it gets offset while I'm going. Notice how my cut along here isn't straight, which is why I'm lining it up with the fold and the selvage as we pointed out before. So just like I did before, I'm going to pin along my grain line, make sure that it's nice and flat. So I can lift my fabric because it's on the edge here so that I don't slide it around so much. And I tend to do the corners before going into the middle. That way I can make sure that it's pressed nice and flat evenly and not have to keep realigning the pins if I went this one, then this one, then this one, and if it shifted as I was going. Now I can make sure my edges and my corners are laid out before doing the middle. So I can actually line up my ruler. So the hard part about doing this is that pins will often cause it to be rickety. So it's not necessarily the easiest way. You could come like along the side of it this way and cut like that. So that gave me a pretty straight line. Like I said, the rotary cutter often will leave some little bits and pieces behind, so you just have to snip. Like I said before, I do tend to just use sharp fabric scissors. And if I was cutting like a large blouse pattern and had maybe an underarm that had a big curve and I had a smaller piece like this, I might try and fit it in that curve from that underarm, keeping it obviously along my grain line as best that I can. So laying out patterns is kind of like fitting a puzzle together, and you just have to try and fit it as close as you can. So if I was going to lay in another one, I might keep my rectangular ones on this side and put my curved ones on this side. I might, now that I have this curve here, I might go back to fitting it this way. Trying to keep my curves to hug against each other. This way. So you can alternate your patterns the way they go as long as your fabric type and grains allow you to do so.